Hello everyone and welcome back to the CyberRanger's CVEs Uncovered video series. This is a gripping video series that will take you on a journey through the heart of cybersecurity's biggest challenges. Join us today as we delve deep into the world of common vulnerabilities and exposures, also known as CVEs, and reveal the stories behind the most severe security breaches of our time. In this episode, we'll be taking a closer look at the Sudoedit Linux privilege escalation vulnerability that was discovered in December 2022 and made public in January 2023. The Sudoedit vulnerability, assigned the CVE code 2023-22809, was discovered by Matthieu, Barjole and Victor Cutillas from the Synacktiv team in December 2022. The vulnerability was identified in the Sudoedit function for Unix that allows a malicious actor or attacker with Sudoedit privileges to edit arbitrary files that they should not have access to. The vulnerability allows a potential bypass of the sudoers policy in Sudo versions 1.8.0 to 1.9.12p1. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at how to identify and exploit the Sudoedit vulnerability on Linux in order to elevate our privileges. Now, in order to follow along with the practical demo, you can actually try out the vulnerability exploitation for yourself by using the free lab available on CyberRanger's, and the URL for that will be in the description section. So this is a completely free lab that you can access. Just visit app.cyberrangers.com and take a look at the community CVE playlist, in which you will actually see the Sudoedit lab. So you can follow along with the practical demonstration once we've taken a look at a technical analysis of the vulnerability. Alright, so to get started, before we even begin taking a look at how the vulnerability can be exploited in a more practical sense, we need to get an understanding or get a vulnerability overview and take a look at the exploitation steps theoretically to understand exactly what's going on. So as you probably know, we're going to be exploring the Sudoedit vulnerability that was assigned the CVE code 2023-22809, and it is pretty much or can be considered a privilege escalation vulnerability. So to begin with, where did this come from? So in December 2022, Matthieu, Barjole and Victor Cutillas from the Synacktiv team discovered a sudoers policy bypass in Sudo version 1.9.12p1 when utilizing Sudoedit. It was found that the successful exploitation of the vulnerability or misconfiguration could allow attackers to elevate privileges on Linux by modifying unauthorized files or by modifying files that user shouldn't be able to access, for example, the etc password file. Taking a closer look at the timeline, we can see that on the 23rd of December 2022, an advisory was sent by Synacktiv or the Synacktiv team to Todd Miller, who pretty much maintains the Sudo utility or binary. On the 5th of January 2023, a patch was released by Todd Miller to pretty much mitigate this vulnerability. On the 6th of January 2023, the CVE code CVE-2023-22809 was assigned to the vulnerability, and on the 18th of January 2023, the vulnerability was publicly disclosed. In terms of the affected versions of Sudo, you can see that the affected versions range from 1.8.0 to 1.9.12p1, and patches have been made available by most major Linux distributions. So taking a closer look at the vulnerability itself, let's understand, pretty much what's going on here. So the vulnerability was identified in the Sudoedit function for Unix or Unix-based operating systems that essentially allows a malicious attacker with Sudoedit privileges to edit arbitrary files. So what this means and this ties into the exploitation requirements, is if a standard user with no sudo privileges or no root privileges is assigned a Sudoedit privilege using the sudoers file or the sudoers functionality, let's say to maybe edit a particular file and that file alone, then we can pretty much, or that pretty much allows that user to elevate their privileges to root by, again, taking advantage or by exploiting this vulnerability. So the vulnerability allows bypass of the sudoers policy in Sudo versions 1.8.0 to 1.9.12p1. The vulnerability can only be exploited if the user-specified editor, in the case of Sudoedit, contains a double hyphen argument. And the reason for this is because it tricks the sudo front end into treating everything after the double hyphen argument in the editor as the file to be edited, even if the sudoers policy doesn't permit it. So you're pretty much just taking advantage of the Sudoedit functionality and the functionality that allows users to specify the editor that they would like to use with Sudoedit. And part of that can be done either manually, or you can actually set the environment variable and include the double hyphen argument and specify the file that you'd like to edit in order to elevate your privileges, like the etc password file. And then after that, you can append, or you really don't need to append, but you can pretty much open up Sudoedit as you would, and try and modify the file that you were supposed to edit, or that user should be allowed to edit. And instead of opening that file, it'll open up the file that you specified either in the environment variable or manually. And of course, this will all become clear as we when we take a look at the demo. So the one thing to understand if you want to get what causes the vulnerability is sudo. So if you're not familiar with Linux or sudo, sudo is pretty much a command line utility for Unix and Unix-based operating systems like Linux and macOS, and the utility is used to provide an efficient way to temporarily grant users privileged access to system resources so that they can run commands that they cannot run under the current privileges associated with the current account. Okay, and moving on to the technical analysis, sudo can be used to edit privileged files while running the editor as an unprivileged user when Sudoedit is invoked, since the sudoers policy file determines if the user has permission to edit the specified files. Normally, or traditionally speaking, the sudoers policy module passes back an argument to the sudo front end that contains the editor to execute the edited files, and that is of course separated by a double hyphen argument. So in terms of the exploitation and the exploitation procedures, you start off with the policy check. So a policy check request is sent by the sudo front end to the sudoers module, indicating that the user has files to be edited once Sudoedit is executed. The sudoers module uses the sudoers file to determine whether the user has permission to edit the above files. So if the above policy check is successful, then the sudoers module chooses an editor based on the following variables in the user's environment. And this is where you can set up the environment variable. But you'll typically have the editor variable, which is pretty much standard. Most of you should know about it. You then have the visual editor and the sudo editor. You'll typically see the Sudoedit editor environment variable set with the editor variable right over here. That's typically what you'll see. So if none of them is set, then the default or first program listed in the editor sudoers is used. So the module then creates a new argument of the selected editor and splits into multiple arguments if the editor has command line options. The double hyphen separator is appended to the argument, followed by the list of files to be edited, which is finally passed back to the sudo front end. The double hyphen separator is used by the sudo front end to determine which files are to be edited. The temporary copies of the files that you would like to edit with Sudoedit are created, and they're created with the ownership set to the current user. Once you've made the changes, typically speaking with Sudoedit, and you save the file, those changes will then be made to the actual file. So in this case, what this means is that we can pretty much set up an environment variable on a system that we have access to, specifically with a user that has the Sudoedit privilege assigned to them in the sudoers file. It really doesn't matter what file they're allowed to edit. We can pretty much take advantage of it by specifying our own editor value to the editor environment variable, and specifying the file that we would like to it, and then just appending a double hyphen to the end, and we can then after that point just open up the Sudoedit command, and it'll, as expected, open up the file that we were supposed to be able to edit. But instead of that, it'll also open up the file that you would like to edit, and that's where privilege escalation comes into play. So it's fair to say that the most obvious option is to just provide your current user with root privileges by modifying the password file and, let's say, providing that user account with a user ID of 0. So sudo the sudo front end creates another argument consisting of all the elements before the double hyphen separator, followed by the temporary file paths that the current user executes. And finally, the temporary files are copied back to the original location and the temporary versions are removed. And this brings us now to the live demo. So I'm going to show you how to get onto the CyberRanger's platform and how to access the free lab where you can take a look at how to exploit the vulnerability for yourself. So let me just switch over. All right, so I'm currently on my browser, and the first thing you need to do to get started with CyberRangers is visit the link app.cyberrangers.com. If you don't have an account already, you can register for one by clicking on this button right over here. If you already have an account, you can just log in with your credentials. And in my particular case, I already have an account, but the link to the actual platform will be in the description section as well as the lab. So once you've created an account and logged in, you can access the lab by navigating to the community section on the sidebar right over here, and you'll see a playlist of labs called CVE labs. And in there, you're going to have a collection of free labs that you can access, like, for example, the log4 shell vulnerability, which we took a look at in a previous video. And we then have the CVE-2023-22809 Sudoedit privilege escalation lab. So you can just click on that and start it. And it's going to take a couple of seconds to start. By the way, the exploitation instructions are also highlighted in the walkthrough for this lab, but we're just going to give it a couple of seconds to maybe a minute to start up, and I'm going to show you how you can use the lab. All right, so once the lab is started, you will be presented with the following screen, where you're going to be taken directly to the overview section. So on the left here, you're going to have a sidebar that has the overview, which is essentially the walkthrough for this lab, and also contains some lab access guidelines here, more of which I'll touch on. But the walkthrough for this lab will pretty much dive deeper into the vulnerability and the demo that I'll be giving you. You then have questions pertinent to this particular lab, so just to verify your knowledge and understanding of the vulnerability, as well as how to identify and exploit it. Under the service tab is where you'll be able to interact with the system in this lab, and that is an Ubuntu system that is running the vulnerable version of Sudo. And if you go back into the overview, you'll see that you'll be provided with access to a standard user account called John, and this particular user has a the Sudoedit privilege assigned to them in order to, or so that they can edit a particular file. Now in this case, the file is not really a sensitive file that they should not have access to. Instead, it's going to be the server's message of the day banner file, and that makes it, much more realistic, because realistically speaking, this is a file that you'd expect the system administrator or someone maintaining the server to be able to edit. And in this case, the user John doesn't have any other sudo privileges or can run any other command or open up any other file with root privileges. So that's the only thing that that they can do, or that's the only file that they can modify. So you can access the lab by clicking on the drop down here called services, and you'll be able to pop up an open SSH, or rather I should say a web shell in your browser that'll give you access to the actual so if I go into options, I'm going to allow pop-ups here. You can see it's going to give you access to a web SSH session within your browser, and once you load that up, you can see you'll be taken or provided with a terminal interface into the lab. So the bottom line is that we're assuming that we've gained access to this system, and we've gained access to the system using a standard user account, and that user is called John. So you can see I can type in who am I right over here, and we can see that the user is indeed John. All right. Now, one thing that I want you to see, is if I say groups and I say John, to see what groups John is a part of. We're not part of the sudo group or the wheel group. And if we say cat etc sudoers, for example, you can see permission denied, and we can use the sudo l command to list out our privileges for the user John. The password for the user John is outlined in the lab access guidelines, and that's just pass123. There we are. So you can see that the user John may run the following commands on Ubuntu. So they can pretty much utilize the sudo edit command or functionality, or function I should say, and they can only modify the etc message of the day file right over here. which pretty much just prints a banner, message of the day. Fairly simple to understand. The bottom line is if I say sudo etc password, and if I try to modify it, you can see that it's going to tell us, that's not found. And if we try to say, for example, sudo cat etc password, my bad, it's going to tell us, sorry, the user John is not allowed to execute that particular binary, and they don't have those privileges. So we currently are an unprivileged user. We can't do anything. If we, try to cat out the contents of the password file, you can see we have the user John here. And ideally, we would like to elevate our privileges to that of the root user, or at least modify this file and change the user ID for the user John to 0, essentially telling the Linux system that we are the root user. So how would we do that? Well, firstly, we need to verify, and check what version of sudo is running on this Linux system. And indeed, you can see that this version 1.9.9 falls within the affected versions in terms of the Sudoedit vulnerability, which is really a sudo vulnerability. So that's the first parameter that we need to check. Now, the second parameter, obviously, if we if I say cat etc or we just say, for example, sudo l, you can see that the file that we're able to edit is etc message of the day. So if I say sudo edit, you can see sudo edit etc message of the day. I can modify that particular file. Okay, so forgot that this is nano, so I'm just going to exit. No, I do not want to save the modified banner. If I list out the permissions for etc message of the day, the actual file itself, just a second. So etc, so etc, and we're just going to display that there, and we're going to see, let's see, do we have any message of the day file? No, we don't. So they can pretty much create it, but the bottom line is we have that assigned to us, and we can leverage this functionality or this particular privilege or permission assigned to this user. So if we take a look at the environment variables for the user John, we can see that he really doesn't have any of the environment variables that are that I outlined in the slides, in that the editor has not been defined. So in order to take advantage of this vulnerability, we can say export, and then the variable we want, environment variable, is called editor, right? Because Sudoedit needs well, it doesn't need, but you can specify what editor you want to use. So ideally we can say sudoedit is equal to we're going to export editor, so pretty much creating the environment variable, and we're going to say editor is equal to, and then we specify the editor we would like to use. Now ideally this would be all that you'd need to do. Now, to take advantage of the vulnerability, we then utilize the double hyphen right over here, and we specify the file that we would like to modify in order to elevate our privileges. In that case, it would be the etc password file. And that's pretty much all that we need to do. So now if we say display the environment variables, you'll be able to see that we have the editor environment variable here that's set to utilize vim and modify the etc password file. So in essence, we simply just need to say sudo edit and etc message of the day, and it'll firstly open up the password file. So I'm going to hit enter, and there you go. So this is a file that we should not be able to modify. Right now, to show you that the changes are indeed what I would call we are able to make changes as opposed to being read-only, we can go to the user John here, and the only thing that we need to do is just change the user ID. So I'm going to insert, and I'm going to say change that to 0, and then the group ID is going to be 0, essentially telling the Linux system that this is a root user. And from that point on, we can pretty much save this. So I'm going to say write and quit. And in this particular case, you can see it's going to say, please enter or type a command to continue. So we've edited it, and we're just going to say write and then quit. There we are. And so if I just say write, and that's been written, and then now we can say quit. There we are. So it's going to tell us that 2 files to edit, and the message of the day was left unchanged. So now if I say cat etc password right over here, you can see that we have modified that file, and now we can pretty much just say su John or super user John put in John's password, and we hit enter, and we now have root privileges, and we've been able to successfully elevate our privileges. So that is an extremely simple vulnerability to exploit. And by the way, you can modify any of the files that ideally should not be able to edit with a standard user account. So pretty much you can edit any files that the root user owns or the root user alone is allowed to modify. And in this case, we've been able to elevate our privileges. So if I say cat etc shadow, for example, that's a file that we can't even view as a standard user, but in this case, you can see that we were able to view it. So that is how to identify and exploit the Sudoedit Linux privilege escalation vulnerability for the purpose of elevating your privileges. Alright, so that brings us to the end of this video. Thank you very much for watching. If you found value in this video, then please do leave a like. If you have any comments or questions, you can leave them in the comment section. And as I mentioned earlier, the lab that we showcased in the practical demonstration is available for free on the CyberRangers platform. You can get started by clicking on the link in the description. With that being said, thank you very much, and I'll be seeing you in the next video.